Thank you.
Henry Louis Gates, Jr.
Thank you.
Dr. Gates, I've interviewed a number of people who've received this award. This one, I was anticipating this one probably more than any other. It's an honor to present you with the Chicago Tribune Literary Award.
I can open it?
It's a little, there you go.
Oh, there you go, okay.
I told you. It
You
might
told me
jump
keep
out
my
and roll on
thumb
the floor.
so it won't roll out. Thank you. It's a great honor.
So you're having a real Chicago experience in the short time that you're here. What are you doing with Kerry James Marshall?
Well, Kerry James Marshall, of course, is a genius, one of the truly great artists practicing in the world today, not just in America, and not just an African-American artist. I've admired him very much, and I know his wife, Cheryl, I met in 1979 here at the Goodman Theater when she was acting in Wole Soyinka's Death and the King's Horseman. Soyinka was my professor. I did my graduate work at the University of Cambridge after I was an undergraduate at Yale, and Soyinka wrote Death and the King's Horseman when I was a student. Then he had a drama troupe come up from London, and he had two people in the audience, and they did a reading of the play, and that was in 1974. And 5 years later, Gregory Mosher was the artistic director at the Goodman, and he asked Soyinka if he could do this play, and I took a month off from Yale, where I was an assistant professor, and came out here and sat through every rehearsal, and had lunch with Soyinka, dinner with Soyinka, with the cast, so I feel like it's my play. And so Chicago's very much part of my larger cultural experience. I have nothing but fond memories about Chicago, except for one.
Uh-oh.
In 1983, I think the University of Chicago English Department was advertising for a professorship in African American literature. And I was an assistant professor at Yale. I didn't have tenure. And I came out and I really wanted that job. And I knew I wasn't going to get tenure at Yale because my tenure book was called The Signifying Monkey. And black people out there, how many people just like, we can't see you, but applaud or laugh if you know about The Signifying Monkey? Well, the lyrics of The Signifying Monkey are the filthy, they make hip hop look like, the Eucharist litany at the Roman Catholic Church. And when I wrote this as my tenure book, people looked at me and said, "Are you out of your mind?" The Yale English Department, 12-letter words that begin with M.
Oscar Brown Jr.
Oscar Brown Jr. Dolomite. Anyway, don't get me started.
That would have been an interesting time to be here because in 1983 was also the year that Harold Washington was elected mayor of Chicago, one of the most fascinating times in the political history of the city. So this award does feel like it's sort of a full circle with you in the Chicago Tribune. It was 25 years ago that the Tribune awarded our Heartland Award for nonfiction.
Yeah, and that was important to me because I had won other awards, but in 1981 I got a MacArthur Award in the first group of MacArthurs, which was totally life-changing for me, and that's another Chicago connection. But this was the first literary award I got. It was I got it for my memoir, Colored People, and it remains my favorite book because it's a book about my mother, really. My daughters I have two daughters, and they're 38 and 36, and they were too young to know my mother. And my older daughter sort of mentioned that casually. I showed her a picture of my mother holding her, and she said she didn't remember her, which made me very sad, because my mother was everything to me. So, after my first year at Harvard, which was 91, 92, I went to the Rockefeller Foundation Research Center in Bellagio on Lake Como, Lago di Como. And I wrote, in 6 weeks, just white heat, I wrote the first draft of Colored People. And I came back, and I wrote in the form of letters to my daughter, to my daughters. Every day I wrote them a different letter about the colored world, the sepia world, the world behind the veil, the world of the 50s and 60s when I was growing up, before the Civil Rights Act and before the Voting Rights Act. I want them to know that wonderful world and its magic. And then when I got back, having written it in the first draft in the epistolary form, my editor said, this is full of stories about people having sex and adultery, and you're writing this to your daughters? Well, you a pervert? You got to change it, you know, so.
If you haven't read this book memoir, you really should, too. It's really...
It's about, you know, all art, to be universal, you have to be particular, right? Hamlet's about a prince in Denmark, right? But it's not about a prince in Denmark. So I wrote about the black world by writing about 300 black people who lived in this tiny little town called Piedmont, West Virginia, where I was born and raised. And, but they were the whole world. You see the world in a grain of sand. I saw the black world through the experiences that I had. I was born in 1950, but experiences I had either watching these other black people, watching the world with these other black people. Unfortunately, we had cable TV. Cable TV came to the Allegheny Mountains, to, a lot of people don't know this, to western Pennsylvania, eastern West Virginia, and western Maryland in 1949, 1950, because the signal wouldn't get over the mountains. Mm-hmm. So I grew up in the mountains on the Potomac River, halfway between Pittsburgh and D.C. Country boy. You know, you get a 410 when you're 12 years old. The first day of deer season is a school holiday in the state. I mean, I love to fish. I don't like to hunt, but I love to fish. So that world, we were able to see the outside world through cable stations coming from D.C. And the Post and the Baltimore Sun, Washington Post and Baltimore Sun, were daily newspapers for us. So we were able to be in the mountains, isolated, and isolated within isolation as a black community in an overwhelmingly white state, West Virginia. Mm-hmm. So I had a lot of interesting filters and distances, that sort of island effect that they talk about with Irish writers writing about England. So I had this a unique view on the world through this handful of black people. And so I wrote about trying to memorialize the colored world of the 50s and 60s through characters that I knew and loved.
And it's beautifully written, too.
Yeah,
I tell you, it was very tempting to come out here and present the award to you and then bring out a large black binder and put it in front of you and have you page slowly through it and say we were going to find your roots, but you've already done that.
Yeah. Well,
but I'm not sure many people know exactly what you found there. There are a lot of startlingly fascinating things about what you've learned about your own history.
You know, lots of people say, how come you haven't done a 25th anniversary edition of Colored People? And the reason is that we found so much more about my ancestry than I knew when I published Colored People, that we don't know whether to write a new book, and I don't want to lose that flavor. I can't go back and write that book. That book was a moment. You know, it was a moment of grief from having lost my mother. It was, I was a messenger from the future writing about the past for my little girls, because I didn't want that black world to be lost. You know, I was in the zone, and it will be a new book. So we don't know whether I should write a new introduction, which records all of this amazing information that genealogists have found about my family since 2005, when I premiered African American Lives, which is morphed into Finding Your Roots, the #1 program on PBS. We beat Antique Roadshow. I used to like antiques.
How stunning was it to start doing that background, look into, and find out that your background is 50% European?
Oh man, I almost had a heart attack. You know, imagine, I'm the chairman of the Department of African and African American Studies. And millions of people discover at the moment I discover that I'm half a white man. It was like so embarrassing. I thought they were going to cut my salary, you know. No reparations money for you, brother.
We may actually share some Irish heritage.
Yeah. No, we knew that, you see, you don't, until you get into genealogy, you don't realize that your number of ancestors doubles each generation. So that you have 2 parents and you have 4 grandparents, but you have 64 fourth great grandparents, because it's n to the second power. And I did my first family tree when I was 9 years old, the day after my grandfather, who looked like a white man, Edward St. Lawrence Gates, the day after we buried him. And my father took me up to his casket at the Kite Funeral Home in Cumberland, Maryland. And I was so startled by how white he looked in the casket. He was so white, ladies and gentlemen, we called him Casper behind his back. And you can imagine how white he looked dead, you know, like he looked a lot whiter. So this is very traumatic to be near a corpse. And that night, my father showed my brother, Dr. Paul Gates, he's an oral surgeon, he just retired. He was chief of dentistry at Bronx Lebanon Hospital in New York. Daddy, after we buried my grandfather, Daddy's father, he took us back to our family home in Cumberland, Maryland. Took us up to my grandparents' bedroom, which we had never been allowed to go upstairs. You know, we thought, I don't know what we thought when they went to bed at night. They just disappeared, some magical world. You know, back in the day, you had to have respect for your elders. You didn't go to somebody's bedroom. You didn't sit on the bed. You never called an older black person by their first name. Forget that. I still refer to my deceased parents, deceased friends as Mr. Ozzie, Miss Mary. You didn't step on a grave. This comes up at Harvard. Kids come up to me. I'm 69 years old. They come up to me and said, "What would you like me to call you?" And I go, "Don't hesitate to call me professor, asshole." You know, what's I don't say the last word.
No, you just did.
No, I did. But the next day, that night, my father showed my brother and me a photograph of the oldest Gates on record. That was Jane Gates, who was my great-great-grandmother. She was a slave. That photograph hangs on the second floor of the home my wife and I own now in Harvard Square. And he showed us her obituary in my grandfather's scrapbooks. He used to work in the bank. He was a janitor in the bank, and he was stealing these bank ledgers and using them as scrapbooks. He would clip newspapers. He loved newspapers. And he showed us her obituary, which was dated January 6, 1888, and I was 9 years old. And the obituary said, "Died this day in Cumberland, Maryland, Jane Gates, an estimable colored woman." And I remember that because when we drove back home, 25 miles away to Piedmont, West Virginia, where the paper mill was, just across the river in Luke, Maryland, the last thing I did before I went to bed, my dad worked 2 jobs. He worked at the paper mill in the daytime as a janitor at the telephone company. So we had more money than the other colored people. I mean, we were all poor, but Daddy had 2 incomes. So we had a nice house. I always had my own bedroom. Rocky, my brother, had his own bedroom and had my own desk and bookcase. And on my desk by my bed sat one of those old, now old-fashioned, I hate to say that, read Webster's dictionary. Mm-hmm. And the last thing I did before I went to bed on January 3rd, 1960, was to look up the word estimable. And I thought, wow, that funny-looking colored lady, she had a midwife. She was a midwife, and she had her midwifery costume on. And I thought, that funny-looking colored lady is my great-great-grandmother, and she's estimable. Maybe I'm estimable, too. So the next day, we went to the colored picnic, because the schools integrated in my county right away in 1955, right after Brown v. Board. But things social were separate. So there was a colored picnic and a white picnic. And after the colored picnic, I asked my dad to buy me a composition book. And that night, in front of our little 12-inch black and white, I guess, RCA Victor TV, I did my family tree. I interviewed my mother and father about her line, and my father about his line. But I only did the vectors. I only did my father's, mother and father's line, and my mother's. It never occurred to me that I had a mother's mother's father, all the interstices, all the branches in your family tree. And now I know that I descend from 3 sets of 4th grade grandparents, which is why I mentioned that number, who were free Negroes, as we would have said, free people of color. 2 sets were freed by the American Revolution, male and female. And then the 3rd set, they were on my mom's side. The 3rd set, they were freed in the will of Abraham Van Meter in 1823. And they all lived 30 miles from where I was born. Wow. So I was looking for Kunta Kinte. And all of the secrets of my family were in the courthouse, Hardy County, West Virginia courthouse, 30 miles away. That's amazing. And John Redmond, a black man, my 4th grade grandfather on my mom's side, fought in the American Revolution. And because of that, my brother and I are members of the Sons of the American Revolution.
Wow.
And ain't there many black people in that, you know?
The memoir essentially ends in West Virginia.
When I'm leaving for Yale.
Right. You went to Exeter for a year. You came back.
I went to Exeter for 6 weeks. I'm the most famous dropout of it.
Right.
No, I'm the most famous colored dropout of Exeter.
You wrote in one of your works that going to Yale may have been both a fulfillment and a betrayal of your parents. What was the conflict in that? How difficult was it to leave West Virginia and go off to...
I was raised to be a doctor. My mom wanted me to be a doctor. My dad wanted me to be a lawyer. Daddy was a news junkie. He read newspapers, did crossword puzzles. He read all the papers. And every night when he came home from his second job, which was about 8 o'clock, he would read the papers and do the crossword puzzle. So, and for my mother, being a doctor, you know, in my generation, Helene's out here, she could tell you, and Stephen, the blackest thing you could be was an educated person in our day first. And then the summa of achievement was to be a medical doctor. For my mother, in heaven, there's the Father, Son, the Holy Ghost, and a medical doctor up there sitting between them. And my brother went to dental school, so I go off to Yale. Now, my brother went to West Virginia University, which was a big deal in 1962. He was one of the few, he has 3 degrees from West Virginia University, 2 in zoology, and then a DDS. Then he specialized, became an oral surgeon. That was like Charlene Hunter Galt going to the University of Georgia or James Meredith going to the University of Mississippi. There were very few black people who had gone to West Virginia University, just a handful of people. Mm-hmm. Katherine Johnson was a graduate student at West Virginia University, but there were very few people. But to go to the Ivy League was a big deal. And I knew that when I came back from Thanksgiving and I went to the bowling alley to see all my partners, you know, they were in college, but they were at Potomac State College, where I'd gone as a freshman, and then I transferred to Yale, or they were at West Virginia University or University of Maryland, that I was a world apart. And, you know, we were drinking a beer, and they called me Skippy, and they go, Skippy, how many students they have up there at Yale? And I said, well, we have 6,000 undergraduates, 6,000 graduate students. They go, man, at West Virginia University, we got 30,000. Like, why would you pay all that money to go up to that school? You know? And I knew that we were in different worlds. It was a different universe. So I tried to be, one of the members of my mother's family went to BU. And when he came back, he was different. He went to divinity school there. His accent had changed. You know, he had different manners. And everybody used to talk about that behind his back. And I didn't want to be that kind of person. So I wanted to be the person that they loved the day I left, even when I came back. So I had to learn how to code shift, you know. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't talk about the fact that I just had William F. Buckley, seen him debate, you know, somebody at Yale or whatever, any of the millions of experiences that open up to you when you leave home. But I think it's true for everybody in this audience. Leaving home at 18 and going to college is a big psychological deal. You change, you become an adult, you have a girlfriend or a boyfriend. Usually that doesn't make it till Christmas if you go to a different school. You know, all your world changes, and navigating that, wanting to keep the nurturing power of home, but wanting to move on and grow and expand. That became negotiating that the journey between those two terrains became very, very important to me.
So we each have an individual history. We also have a collective history in this country. And you've recently explored one of the, but difficult is probably a gross understatement of it, but with Stony the Road and the companion project, Reconstruction, on PBS. Let's talk about that after we watch a short clip.
Oh, great.
Most of us know that our country fought a civil war in the 1860s, but less is known about what came afterward, the chaotic, exhilarating, and ultimately devastating period known as Reconstruction.
Did you ever study Reconstruction in school?
No.
A paragraph or two. We never really studied it.
I didn't learn anything about Reconstruction.
Reconstruction was our shining moment. It's the second founding of our country.
Overnight, people who have been defined as property take leadership positions in the South. So this is an incredibly heady moment, kind of like Barack Obama becoming president. But those black folks had no idea of the cliff they were heading towards.
Reconstruction produced a violent backlash, a racist backlash.
I want us to tell the truth about our history, not to punish America. I want to liberate us, but we can't get to liberation if we don't acknowledge what we've done.
It's our town now!
Do you believe that we as a nation are still undergoing the process of Reconstruction?
You might almost say it never ended. We are still trying to come to terms with the consequences of the end of slavery in this country.
This is a chapter of our history that's been misrepresented and misunderstood. It's time that we acknowledge the true story and complete the work of reconstructing America.
Thank you.
You wrote, the more African Americans achieve, the more they put their lives at risk. There was this brief moment, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments are passed, we're on the way, black leaders go into legislators, and then just whomp.
Wow.
What happened?
Well, when I was trying to sell this idea to PBS, they go, Reconstruction, who cares? And I said, 12 years of black freedom. The Reconstruction period officially is from 1865 to 1877. I said, well, let me put it this way. 12 years of black freedom followed by an alt-right rollback. Does that sound familiar, like anything that's happened in the United States? And they go, how much money do you need? I made it as an analogy to what we're experiencing today. Unprecedented power for the former slaves. What finally ended slavery was not the Emancipation Proclamation. As we all know now that we've watched Ava DuVernay's the 13th, it was the 13th Amendment, ratified on December 6, 1865. And the three Reconstruction amendments are the 13th, the 14th, which establishes the Equal Protection Clause, and birthright citizenship. Birthright citizenship didn't exist in the United States until the 14th Amendment, and they had to do birthright citizenship because they couldn't figure out how to make the slaves citizens. So they go, somebody says, well, they're born here. They go, wow, eureka, that's a great idea. And then the 15th Amendment, that's 1868, it's the 14th, and the 15th is ratified in 1870, and that gave black men the right to vote. But because of the Reconstruction Act in 1867, black men in the former Confederate states, in 10 of the 11 former Confederate states, got the right to vote. So the first freedom summer is the summer of 1867. There are according to the 1860 census, there are 3.9 million African Americans living in slavery a year before the Civil War breaks out. It's like, okay, half of them are men, let's say roughly, right? And almost all of them are illiterate because it was illegal to teach a slave to read or write. Well, in 1867, they did this voter registration campaign throughout the former Confederacy. 80% of the black men eligible to register to vote registered to vote. 80%, that's mind-boggling. And guess what? A year later, in 1868, they voted. Those men elected U.S. Grant president of the United States. Grant won overwhelmingly in the Electoral College, but he only won the popular vote by 300,000 votes. 500,000 black men cast their votes for Ulysses S. Grant. This was black power manifesting itself through the ballot in a way that no one had expected. And we tend to forget two other interesting facts. South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana were majority black states. And Florida, Alabama, and Georgia were almost majority black states. This meant that there could have been almost a mini black republic within the republic. And the idea of all this black power, South Carolina, majority House of Representatives. The Secretary of State was black. The Secretary of the Treasury was black, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that flipped out liberals in the North as well, obviously, as former Confederates. In 1875, the United States Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which gave black people equal access to public transportation, hotels, public accommodation, et cetera, et cetera. But systematically, starting in 1873, then 1876, and then in 1883, the Supreme Court, a conservative Supreme Court, declared either limited the reach of the Reconstruction amendments, and then declared the Civil Rights Act of 1875 completely unconstitutional. And as you know, we all know, in 1876, the Hayes-Tilden Compromise led to Rutherford B. Hayes becoming president of the United States and the withdrawal of troops from the South, which were protecting black men's right to vote. Not everybody in the South was crazy about all this black power. As you might expect, the 13th Amendment was ratified December 6, 1865, but the Ku Klux Klan is born in December of 1865. There are 8 major massacres between 1866 and 1876 of black people because of voting. Voting, it turned out, was the true first sheer manifestation of black power, because all black people were concentrated in the South because of slavery. It was called the Black Belt because of the color of the soil for growing cotton and because of the color of the people. And so it was systematically rolled back by the Supreme Court, and slowly Democrats, former Confederates, gained control of the 11 Confederate states. And starting in 1890, they rewrote the state constitution. They couldn't get rid of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, but they could go around them by creating poll tax requirements, literacy test requirements, which are really comprehension exams that only a Harvard law professor could understand. And I'll show you how dramatically effective that voter suppression, those voter suppression mechanisms were. In 1896, Louisiana, one of the majority black states, had 130,000 black men registered to vote. After they ratified their new state constitution, that number was reduced by 1904 precisely to 1,342. And that happened all throughout the South. So the last Reconstruction congressman was kicked out, George Henry White, in 1901. But there were 16 black congressmen elected between 1870 and 1877, including 2 to the Senate. And by 1901, 20 black congressmen to the House, 2 to the Senate. Then there was not another black congressman elected until Oscar DePriest, 1929, from our very own Chicago, Illinois. And because of
What party was he?
He was
You wouldn't believe it today.
a Republican, because we were all Lincoln Republicans. I grew up, my parents were Republicans until JFK, and then definitely Barry
Chicago
Goldwater.
Tribune is very proud to have Lincoln as a subscriber, and we have a letter from him renewing his Well, Lincoln was the first great cause of the Chicago Tribune, Lincoln and abolition.
That's fabulous. That's a great tradition.
So you, in Stony the Road, the imagery in that, the ugly, racist imagery, really is very compelling in that it shows this wasn't a fringe movement. It wasn't even necessarily a Southern movement.
No.
This was on Warner Brothers cartoons. This was on national films being shown by Woodrow Wilson in the White House.
Right. Starting in 1890, the same year, Mississippi had Mississippi was the first of the former Confederate states to reenact this new horrible constitution. It was called the Mississippi Plan, which by 1906 had swept the South. because of an accident in technology, not the invention of chromolithography, which was invented earlier in the 19th century, but the process was refined so it was very cheap to produce four-color images. And what was the natural four-color subject? Black skin, thick red lips, white of the eyes, and black hair. And so Sambo art, as we call it, proliferated through American mass culture. And this created the first social media war, because the African Americans who were educated, the talented 10th, as W.E.B. Du Bois put it, the new Negro, which was a trope that was invented right after Henry Brady invented the metaphor of the New South. The new Negro countered by creating images of black people with three-piece suits and, playing the piano at home and using this new popular medium of photography. Photography was much older, but it became cheaper and you could circulate images more readily. They created images of the new Negro, the refined three-piece suit, women and dressed as if they were going to church. Very much Victorian, both black Victorian men and black Victorian women, to counter this mass proliferation, millions of images of black people as venal, lascivious, liars, thieves. And as you say, the new silent movie industry was full of these racist depictions of black people, reaching an apex in 1915 with The Birth of a Nation. Most of us had to look at Birth of a Nation in some history course when we were in college, and people tend to think of it as a revisionist history of the Civil War, but it wasn't. It was a revisionist history of Reconstruction. And most of the crucial scenes take place in that majority black South Carolina legislature. And it shows a black man with their feet up, eating chicken wings, drinking whiskey, and they all go crazy. And remember, it's a silent movie, so you have captions. And you wonder why they're so ecstatic. They've just passed a miscegenation law, that black men now have the right to marry white women.
Did Woodrow Wilson understand what he was doing when he screened that?
Many of the captions in Birth of a Nation are taken from Woodrow Wilson's history of the United States. And he and D.W. Griffith knew each other at Johns Hopkins. Woodrow Wilson was he was one of the worst racists in the history of the White House. He's getting some rivalry.
All right,
let me make it clear.
Okay.
I'm often asked, do I think Donald Trump's a racist? Whoopi asked me on The View. I've never met Donald Trump, and I don't think that we should throw around terms like that. So only God knows what's in a person's heart. So I don't want to be quoted saying I think Donald Trump's a racist. But I do think Donald Trump is a genius at manipulating the tropes of white supremacy. And I don't think anybody can argue with that. And that's a bad thing.
All right, let's come up to today and what kind of parallels there are. I want to ask you first, there was probably a naive tendency on some part when Barack Obama was elected to think, well, our work is done. Or at least to think we turned a corner.
Racism's over.
So what, outside of his healthcare, we could take the issues off what he accomplished. How did he change the country, and what kind of backlash do you think there was?
Well, Andy Young, I'm making a new series on the history of the black church. Every year we do Finding Your Roots, and then every other year I do a new black history series. And I interviewed Andy Young down at Ebenezer Baptist Church in June. And he said, I think our people are still on a freedom high from electing Barack. That nobody could believe it. Then I remember I cried. I sat there in Larry Bobo's house next door to mine, and when Wolf Blitzer called it, we all knew something terrible was going to happen. It was like the night that Jesse Jackson was going to win in Michigan, remember? And we all went to bed and woke up, and white people remembered they were white, and Jesse was black, and then he didn't win. So we were afraid that something terrible was going to happen, that the prince was not going to be crowned, right? But he actually won. And then there were all these books, which I really resisted and I fought against, saying it was the end of racism and the end of race, that America had miraculously purged itself, cleansed itself, and repudiate its original sin, slavery and its corollary, anti-black racism. But I never believed that. I'm a scholar. Nothing happened just because of one even transformative person. as brilliant and as subtle and as, I started to say articulate, as, as Barack Obama, and the powerful combination of Barack and Michelle, and that beautiful family. And I thought that slowly, even the worst white racists would see the best of black people. This is like the trope of the new Negro, that these were, and I start the book by going back to this myth of a new Negro who would who would repudiate anti-black racism. And what happened was that there were a whole lot of people, we discovered to our horror, who were flipped out by the election of a black man to the White House and by the occupancy of this beautiful black family in the White House over 8 years. And they showed it in two ways. One, through what happened at Mother Emanuel, Charlottesville, the rise of white supremacy, its manifestation in the most public and horrific ways, and two, in the election of Donald Trump. But watching these white supremacists come back after experiencing the exhilaration of the election of the first black president, it's like watching them, Hollywood, a zombie movie, man. You know, it's the end. You've beaten the zombies. You sit down to dinner, and all of a sudden you hear this noise, and they start coming out of the floor, and you go, "I thought your ass was dead." You know, what we have to do to get garlic cloves and put a stake in your heart? But these people are out there, and they're pissed off, and they're angry, and they're taking it off. This is why Reconstruction was the perfect, subtle analogy to make. What are the issues of Reconstruction? Birtherism, who has the right to be an American citizen, birthright citizenship, voter suppression, right? Xenophobia. But not only that, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, the construction of the wall. All of these, the relationship between political and economic democracy. These are all Reconstruction issues which weren't resolved in the 19th century and which are manifesting itself now. When Marielle, my wife who's here, she's a historian of Cuban slavery. When we were watching Charlottesville, I couldn't understand what these guys were chanting, you know, and I kept listening, and they say, Jews will not replace it. I thought they were in a time warp. You know, what are they talking about? This is Nazi propaganda from the 30s, and it's back, and all the bombings of synagogues and the vocal voicing of anti-Semitic stereotypes, which we thought were long buried. So we need the same coalition that elected Barack. We need to reform it to fight the manifestation of white supremacy.
We have some good questions from the audience that were pre-submitted, so let's go through some of those. From Holly Rosner, can you explain how you would define the difference between white supremacy and racism? Which is more dangerous, more universal, more damaging?
Yes, white supremacy is an ideology. With a long history, it has texts, a crazy text, like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, you know, and many others, which was subsidized by Henry Ford, actually, like the Jewish conspiracy to run the world, as well as a million tracts and pamphlets about the nature of black people. The Negro, a Beast, I write about, was published in 1900. You know, theories about the descent from Ham, and that we're really related to apes, and that there wasn't an Adam and Eve, metaphorically, that we weren't all 50,000 years ago, our common human ancestors weren't running around East Africa for all the people in this room and all the people in the world. There were separate Adams and Eves, metaphorically, separate modes of human evolution. So black people had theirs, and white people had theirs, you know, and all kind of crazy madness. That's white supremacy. Racism, Cornel West, my dear friend, has an expression I love. He says, we're all recovering homophobes. We're all recovering anti-Semites. We're all recovering racists. There's implicit bias. There's, you know, if I turn on, I never watch boxing anymore, but I used to, you know, when the golden age for me. If he was fighting a white guy, well, it wouldn't have mattered. I wanted Ali to win. But if I saw a black boxer and a white boxer, I probably would go with the black boxer. You know, I mean, that's a kind of implicit sort of racism. You know, you want your own people to win and the underdog, et cetera, et cetera. And that manifests itself in a lot of ways. So we have implicit bias in Claude Steele, Mahjarine Banaji at Harvard, Claude at Stanford, and lots of other people have written about that. And every corporation should have a seminar on implicit unconscious bias, and every American should understand about that. That, I think, is a branch of what I would call racism. Or when we repeat stereotypes, that Jews are like this, black people are like this. My father would, he loved sports. He could have done color. You know, he had a photographic memory, and he knew who hit the most home runs in 1929, that kind of stuff. But when they would interview black athletes at halftime, if the poor man said this and that and used spoken black vernacular, Daddy would say, the boy majored in basketball, you know? But if he spoke proper English, you know, saying INGs and his T's, he'd say, he's a well-educated young man. So that's a bias too. And we see this in all the studies that places like Harvard Business School have done with, and many civil rights organizations, people applying for jobs, and they have names which are thought to be black, African-American culturally. And these people don't get interviews, or a black person shows up to rent an apartment, they have the wrong name or the wrong phenotype. All these are forms of social bias. But white supremacy is an ideology. It's a cult, and it's very, very dangerous. We were talking last night at dinner with Kerry James and Tom Mitchell, my good friend and professor of English, and his wife Janice, a musicologist, a musician. Tom is at the University of Chicago. And Walter and Shirley Massey, who were all there. I mean, it was a great feast. I'm thinking about Shaw's Crab and how good the food was, and
it is.
How much we're talking. I can't remember the point I was going to make, but
all right, then we'll move to the next one.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah, but it was good, and it was a good point too.
Did you have the soup? Yeah, the clam chowder.
No, I'm lactose intolerant. So if I ate that clam chowder, I'd have to take a bottle of Lactaid to do it. But somebody had seafood bolognese. I mean, a bouillabaisse. Somebody had a bouillabaisse, right?
All right, from Ann Thompson. What form must reparations take to be effective in bringing about equity?
Well, you know, but my hologram performance in Watchmen is all about reparations. This woman, the star of the show, comes and wants to find out who she is. And in this America, which had 30 years of the presidency of Richard Nixon, and now Robert Redford's the president, and I'm the Secretary of the Treasury, right? If you're descended from the Tulsa riots of 1921, which wiped out Black Wall Street, you know, the richest black community in history, in 24 hours, if you can establish a DNA connection to one of the victims, then you get reparations, right? So that's one of the themes. That's why I'm in it. Because I'm the hologram, and you come and I say, how can I help you? If you can prove that you are a descendant, we'll give you reparations. So let me swab your cheek, and you push a button, and I give you a DNA kit, and then we call you 6 weeks later. Well, so it's very funny that they've taken reparations as a theme and put it on a big HBO.
But you've been skeptical in the past.
Yeah, well, I'm for reparations in the form, because it's stereotyped as a check that everybody black's going to get a check. To me, reparations would manifest themselves in 2 or 3 powerful ways. The first would be the continuation of the same affirmative action programs that led to me being on this stage and every black person and every woman in this room being in this room. I would have gone to college, but I wouldn't have gone to Yale. Why do I say that? I went to Yale in 1969 because there were 6 black men who graduated in the class of 66 at Yale, and there were 96 who came to New Haven in September of 1969. And you know who was in my class? Kurt Schmoke, first black mayor of Baltimore. I mean, he graduated the year before me, but we were all part of the affirmative action experiment. Sheila Jackson Lee, Barbara Jordan Seat in Houston. a whole bunch of doctors and lawyers and investment bankers, but there was a young pre-med guy who was kind of nerdy. He used to go to the black parties, but he didn't really hang out that much. I always forget his name. I'm having a senior moment. Ben Carson. Yeah, Ben Carson. Candy Carson, his wife, was in the class behind us. We were all there together, man. And we would have met at Howard or Morehouse or Spelman or Fisk, but we wouldn't have met at Yale. And our fates would have been completely different. What happened between 1966 and 69? Affirmative action. So for me, who has benefited, nobody in America, as far as I'm concerned, has benefited more from the opening of the gates enabled by affirmative action than I have. And for me to be a gatekeeper, and it would be disingenuous if I didn't say I was a gatekeeper, no matter how small my gates. For me to be a gatekeeper and stand at that gate and try to keep out other people of color or women would make me a hypocrite as big as, maybe a Supreme Court justice.
Great.
And one more thing. I think that I'm no expert on public education, but it seems to me that one of the most radical forms that reparations could take, and one of the most radical ways that public schools could be reformed, would be if we made equal the amount of money we spent per child in each school all across the United States. That is Secretary of the Treasury Henry Louis Gates' hologram's affirmative action program.
From Deborah Bragg, what African-American personal history has surprised you most so far, and why?
Well, I was pretty surprised to find out that I was half a white man. That was definitely a big thing. And that my own, that I had an ancestor, a black man who fought in the American Revolution. I was hard to live with that day. That's pretty cool. But the biggest thing that surprised me is when we find what are called non-paternity events. When I started this only with black people. It was called African American Lives, and I got the idea in the middle of the night. And the next day I called Quincy Jones, because he had scored the music for Roots, and Quincy was very much into genealogy. But I wanted Quincy because he was my friend, but I also wanted him because who is Quincy Jones' best friend? Does anybody here know? The big O, Oprah. And why did I need Oprah? Because I needed $6 million to do this.
That's why you have an Oprah wall.
There you go. I got
office.
an Oprah wall in my office. No, she didn't give me money, but being able to walk into a corporation to say, how would you like your product associated with the whole world knowing what ethnic group Oprah Winfrey is descended from? They go, how much do you need? That big ATM machine just slowly descended. But I did it first. The whole conceit was that I would reveal, the narrative arc would culminate with African Americans finding out where they were from in Africa, a la Alex Haley. But when I started filming Oprah, and then we decided that to get you to the Middle Passage and take you across the ocean, we needed to do their family trees. And I was into that anyway. And because of digitization, we were able to find phenomenal things. And now, it's 15 years later, we can do things in seconds that took months, and before digitization took years. So when I showed Oprah the names of her enslaved ancestors, she just broke down and cried like a baby. And when I told her what ethnic group she was from, it was an intellectual response. And I have never gotten an emotional response from a black person about what their African ethnic roots are. People are fascinated. I even took Chris Tucker back to Angola, to an ethnic group that his father shares a Y-DNA signature with. And it's an intellectual experience. It's a little emotional. But when you show people the names of their ancestors on their family trees, white and black.
Yeah, it's amazing to watch.
It is amazing, and they melt. They just fall apart. And so the biggest surprise was I had to tell LL Cool J, because we have a protocol that you cannot, it's not Jerry Springer, right? I can't tell you your father's not your father in front of millions of people, in effect. I have to call you. We worked out this ethics protocol with the the genetic scientists, because people have nervous breakdowns and stuff, and there are a lot of support groups for people who just routinely take one of the DNA tests offered by the commercial companies and really have to go into therapy because their father's not their father. So LL Cool J's Todd Smith, and I'd met him through Quincy, and he's a very good friend to this day. And I had to call him. He was on the set of NCIS, and I had to tell him that his mother was adopted. And that was a really big deal because she didn't know. B, Todd's father shot his mother in the middle of the night in a big argument. So when she recovered, they obviously got a divorce, and she moved in with her parents. And so he loved his grandparents. And his grandfather was a surrogate father for him. And when he made it his first rap video, Mama, I'm Knock You Out, I think it's called, his grandmother comes down the stairs at the end of this video and says, Todd, take the garbage out. It's hilarious. And I had to tell him, A, that his mother was adopted, and B, that these grandparents that he had even written about had no biological connection to him. And he went nuts. He shouted at me and said it was a trick. And then his hobby's boxing. And he said to me while he was arguing, yelling at me, well, who was my grandfather then? And expletive. And I said, well, it turns out that he was a light heavyweight champion of the world in the 1930s, And he goes, you're fucking with me, boxing, quote unquote. Boxing's my hobby. This is a trick. And I go, Todd, I don't know anything about you, man. I just know about your DNA. And your mother was adopted. And he said, well, what am I supposed to do with this information? And I said, well, I'm calling you. You can drop out of the series and nobody will know. We have everybody's in a code name. Only 5 people have access to the DNA. And you can drop out, but if I were you, I would call my mother. And so he called back in about 3 minutes, and I said, oh my God, he's going to yell at me some more. And I said, did you talk to your mother? And he said, yeah. And I said, what'd she say? She said, is it possible that my father was my biological father, but my mother was not my biological mother? That meant that she thought that she was adopted. And it turns out, ladies and gentlemen, that when she was 12 or 13, her aunt, her putative aunt, right, had a baby. And Todd's mother was with all the women in the parlor, and she said, that baby's so beautiful, I hope that when I grow up, I can have a baby that looks just like that. And the evil aunt looked at her and said, honey, that will never happen. And that night, she went to her mother, Todd Smith, LL Cool J's mother went to her mother and said, Mama, am I adopted? And she said, no. And she asked her 4 times over the course of her life, including on her deathbed. And they had never had a good relationship after that. They had had a tense relationship because the mother knew that she was harboring this secret. And then miraculously, we found Todd's mother's biological mother. She was living in a nursing home. She was 89 years old, and we tracked her down and through DNA. And we contacted her guardian, who was her 25-year-old granddaughter. And our producers called and said, look, we don't want to cause any trouble, but your grandmother had a child in 1947 and put her up for adoption. Now, we don't want to give her a heart attack, but obviously this will make good filming for PBS if we can do this. So morally, the decision's up to you. What are you going to do? She got, I'm going to hang up and call her. She goes, Grandma, Henry Louis Gates said you had a baby in 1947. and Todd's grandmother said, it wasn't me, it was my sister. My sister had that baby. But then she said it was she. And we connected them, and Todd has a whole new family, man. That was like, and he thanks me every day, for giving him his family. It's a miracle of DNA and what we can do with finding your roots. It's a great thing.
I'm going to ask you, we're out of time, unfortunately. We could spend the whole afternoon listening to you.
I'm having a great time.
Really. So
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One quick question from Molly. What books similar to Stony the Road would you recommend for readers who want to learn more about Reconstruction.
The king of Reconstruction, and I want to say something else about this prize, so don't.
I'm going to get to that,
Oh,
too.
okay, great. The king of Reconstruction studies is Eric Foner, and he wrote the Bible on Reconstruction. And when I got the idea, I called him and I said, Eric, I'm going to make you the chief consultant and put you on the camera. I can't do this without you. He's written 10 books about Reconstruction, and his latest book is about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But you know what I'm proudest of in this series? One, it's subtle. We don't beat people over the head about the connections to things going on today, the voter suppression and who has the right to be an American, birthright citizenship. But secondly, I put 50 historians on camera. 50 historians, half of whom are women and half of whom are black. And I'm very proud of them.
You have a beautiful idea related to this prize that we were talking about backstage, and I want to make sure that you have to tell the folks here.
Well, many of you know who Charles Ogletree is. Charles Ogletree was my colleague at the Harvard Law School. He's now retired, and he was my fishing buddy. But you know him because he was Anita Hill's lawyer at the Clarence Thomas hearings, and he was the mentor to a guy who became president of the United States. He was Michelle and Barack's mentor at the Harvard Law School, and one of the greatest fishermen who ever lived. When you go to the National African American Museum, there is an exhibit on black people on Martha's Vineyard, and my picture's there because I'm there with Charles Ogletree and Judge Harry Edwards and 2 other people at the end of the day, and it has our haul. The number of striped bass that we had caught, and so it's great. And a few years ago, after we fish, Harry Edwards has a house over on, he's a very famous federal judge. He has a house over on the Cape. He takes the ferry over. I pick him up, and then we go to Captain Buddy Vanderhoop, who's a native, a Wampanoag. His family came to the island, he told us 10,000 years ago, you know. And we go fishing all day, and it's so much fun. And then we come back, we go to Vernon Jordan's house, and we have, you know, fried clams and oysters and French fries. And a few years ago, Vernon called me the next day. Vernon's the godfather. I mean, he's, to me, the most powerful black man that's ever lived in the United States. And I love him. I adore him. And he called me, and he said, did you notice any, we call Charles Tree. Did you notice anything weird about Tree? And I did. He would just, you know, we drink beer and eat all this fried seafood and lie and signify and tell stories and who's doing whom and, you know, what deals are going down in Washington. And Vernon knows, you know, he's a deal maker. And Charles sat there and oddly, weirdly, just looked out in space, you know, like glazed. And then I started noticing other little symptoms. He was on CNN one night, and he answered a question he wasn't asked. And I turned to Mary Ellen and I said, did you hear that? And she goes, well, you know, that's a trick that you, as you know, if a journalist asks you a question you don't like, answer a different question, right? Yeah. So I thought, but there was no reason for him to do that. And then other things. And then finally, then there were rumors. And finally, his wife, and he called and said that he was going to go to the annual meeting of the AME Church, the African American Episcopal Church, and announce that he had Alzheimer's disease. And in last Sunday's Boston Globe, I guess now 2 Sundays ago, there was a front page article, a long, beautiful article, and so sad, it's hard for me even to talk about. Charles is younger than I am, summa cum laude from Stanford, Harvard Law School. He founded the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute. Charles Hamilton Houston was the first black person to make the Harvard Law Review, and then went to Howard and established the law school and trained Thurgood Marshall. Charles Hamilton Houston was the man, right? And now Charles just, he wouldn't know me or I don't even know if he knows his wife. He can't fish. We were going to go fishing together. At the last minute, Pam called and said that he couldn't go, and Buddy told me that he just would cast his hook out and just reel it in over and over and over again. And it is devastatingly sad for me personally. And when I read the article, I decided to donate the prize money to Alzheimer's research in the name of Charles.
That's a wonderful thing to do. Henry Louis Gates, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you.